In 1981, a fire destroyed an abandoned grain mill in Missouri. When responders arrived, they found 19 bodies inside, burned, silent, and unidentified. No one had reported them missing. No names matched any local registry. Inside the building were chalk circles on the floor, ledgers filled with numbers were found, and a rusted steel drum full of teeth. State investigators assumed it was a squatter fire until a Child Protective Services agent flagged the symbol on one of the walls. The mark matched an open case from 6 years earlier, a girl named Lena, age 9, who disappeared from foster care. She had drawn the same symbol in crayon, but Lena was never found, and no child's body was among the 19. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Comment your city, hit the like button if you're already creeped out, and subscribe if you want more cases like this one. Some stories don't stay buried, neither should you. Heinrich Müller arrived at the Millbrook Iron Works on March 15, 1894, carrying impeccable references and an unusual interest in worker welfare. The mill's previous foreman had departed suddenly after a dispute with management, leaving the facility's 312 workers without proper supervision during a critical production period. Muller's employment application, preserved in company archives, presented him as an experienced industrial manager with previous positions at steel mills in Cleveland and Detroit. His references praised his innovative approaches to worker productivity and his deep understanding of industrial safety protocols. What the references did not mention was that both previous employers had experienced unusual numbers of workplace fatalities during Muller's tenure. The Millbrook Iron Works occupied 14 acres along the Monongahela River, producing railroad components and industrial machinery for the expanding American rail network. The facility's owner, Jonathan Hartwell, had been impressed by Muller's proposals for improving both worker efficiency and safety records through what he termed comprehensive worker development programs. Within days of his arrival, Muller began implementing changes that would transform the mill's operations. He established mandatory safety meetings, reorganized work schedules to reduce fatigue-related accidents, and created what he called worker improvement societies, designed to enhance both technical skills and moral character. The improvement societies met twice weekly in a converted storage building adjacent to the main mill structure. Attendance was voluntary but strongly encouraged, with Muller personally inviting workers he deemed most suitable for advancement opportunities. These selected individuals received his special attention and gradually formed the core of what would become his criminal organization. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong at the Millbrook Iron Works occurred on April 7, 1894. Just 23 days after Muller's appointment as foreman. James Crawford, a 29-year-old mill worker with 18 months of unblemished service, was found dead in the rolling mill machinery during the early morning shift. The official incident report, signed by Muller and filed with company management, attributed Crawford's death to worker negligence and failure to observe established safety protocols. The report stated that Crawford had been working alone when he became entangled in the machinery, dying instantly from his injuries. However, the mill's night watchman, Thomas Kelly, had discovered Crawford's body at 3:47 a.m. during his regular security rounds. Kelly's original incident report, found decades later buried in company archives, told a dramatically different story. According to Kelly's account, Crawford had been found with his hands bound behind his back with hemp rope. Kelly's original report described finding evidence of a struggle in the work area surrounding the machinery. Tool racks had been overturned, metal shavings were scattered in patterns inconsistent with normal operations, and most disturbing of all, Crawford's body showed injuries that appeared to have occurred before his entanglement in the machinery. The original report was replaced within hours by Muller's simplified version, and Kelly was reassigned to different duties with a substantial pay increase and strict instructions not to discuss the incident with anyone outside mill management. Kelly would later testify to federal investigators that he had been explicitly threatened with dismissal and potential criminal charges if he contradicted the official account. Crawford's widow, Margaret, received the standard $200 insurance payment administered through the Pittsburgh Mutual Insurance Company. The compensation represented typical coverage for accidental workplace death and was processed without investigation, as the mill had maintained an exemplary safety record prior to Muller's arrival. More disturbing details emerged through personal correspondence discovered years later. In a letter dated April 12, 1894, Margaret Crawford wrote to her sister describing her husband's strange behavior in the weeks preceding his death. The letter, preserved in family papers donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society, revealed that James had been attending Mueller's evening meetings and had returned home speaking of sacred revs. Elations about the true purpose of industrial labor. Margaret's letter described her husband's transformation from a practical, hard-working man into someone obsessed with what he called purification through suffering. James had begun speaking of his fellow workers in terms of spiritual worthiness and had expressed the belief that some were chosen for special service that would elevate them above ordinary laborers. The second suspicious death occurred on May 12, 1894, just 5 weeks after Crawford's demise. Thomas Beck, a 34-year-old foundry worker, died from severe burns sustained during what was reported as an accidental contact with molten iron. The incident report again cited worker error as the primary cause, and Beck's family received identical insurance compensation. Beck's death presented even more obvious inconsistencies than Crawford's accident. The foundry foreman, William Hayes, had 22 years of experience with molten metal operations and immediately recognized that Beck's burn patterns were impossible to explain through accidental contact. Hayes privately documented his concerns in notes that would later prove crucial to the federal investigation. According to Hayes's observations, Beck's burns showed evidence of prolonged exposure to extreme heat rather than the instantaneous contact that would result from an accidental fall or slip. The pattern of injuries suggested that Beck had been restrained during the burning process, as the burns were concentrated on his back and legs while his hands and arms showed defensive wounds. Dr. Margaret Walsh, who examined Beck's body, made additional disturbing discoveries that she recorded in her private medical notes. Beck showed clear evidence of having been bound at the wrists and ankles, with rope burns visible beneath the more severe thermal injuries. Most significantly, his fingernails contai. Metal shavings suggesting he had clawed desperately at restraints during his ordeal. Both Crawford and Beck had been regular attendees at Muller's Worker Improvement Society meetings. Membership records discovered in Muller's personal effects showed that both men had been marked with strange symbols in his private ledger. These symbols, later identified by linguistic experts as corrupted religious iconography, appeared next to the names of 17 different workers throughout Muller's tenure. Federal investigators would eventually discover that every individual marked with these symbols had either died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared entirely. The symbols appeared to represent Muller's selection process for workers he deemed suitable for what his journal referred to as sacred elevation through sacrifice. The Improvement Society meetings had begun as legitimate safety discussions, but gradually evolved into something far more sinister. According to testimony from surviving members, Muller began incorporating religious elements into the sessions by summer 1894, speaking of the mill as a sacred space where workers could achieve spiritual advancement through their dedication and suffering. Anna Crawford, James Crawford's sister-in-law, had attended several early meetings and provided federal investigators with crucial testimony about their true nature. She described Muller's charismatic speaking style and his ability to convince practical, working-class men that their industrial labor was part of a divine mission that required absolute devotion and sacrifice. Muller's personal correspondence from this period, discovered during the investigation, revealed his systematic approach to psychological manipulation. In a letter to his brother dated September 18, 1894, he wrote, "The work progresses according to plan. These simple men understand that their purpose extends far beyond mere labor. Soon the chosen will demonstrate their fate." Through the ultimate offering. The transformation of Muller's worker improvement societies into a full religious cult began in earnest during the winter of 1894 to 1895. What had started as workplace safety meetings evolved into an organization that would systematically murder its own members while maintaining the facade of industrial progress and spiritual enlightenment. Muller's approach to cult formation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Rather than immediately demanding extreme behavior from his followers, he gradually escalated his requirements over months, using techniques that would later be studied by federal investigators as early examples of systematic mind control in American criminal history. The pivotal moment came on December 21, 1894, during what Muller announced as a sacred gathering to mark the winter solstice. For the first time, he required attendance not just from Brotherhood workers, but from their wives and children as well. This family meeting, held in the basement of the company boarding house, marked the beginning of total control over members' personal lives. Elizabeth Kerner, wife of Brotherhood member Franz Kerner, attended this gathering and would later provide federal investigators with detailed testimony about Muller's methods. According to her account, Muller announced that traditional family structures were obstacles to spiritual advancement and that the Brotherhood would now function as a single, unified family under his paternal guidance. During this gathering, Mueller instituted what he called spiritual reorganization of brotherhood families. Children over the age of 6 were to be separated from their parents and housed in communal dormitories where they would receive proper religious education. Wives were instructed to view their husbands as servants of the sacred mission, rather to as independent individuals with personal desires or needs. The separation of children from their parents served multiple purposes in Mueller's systematic control strategy. Parents who might otherwise resist his more extreme demands were compelled to comply when their children's welfare was held hostage. The children themselves were more easily indoctrinated when removed from parental influence and subjected to concentrated psychological manipulation. Mueller's success in securing compliance with family separation demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He presented the policy not as punishment but as honor, convincing parents that their children had been selected for special spiritual advancement that would benefit the entire family's eternal salvation. The communal housing arrangements were established in converted mill buildings that Mueller had secretly modified during late 1894. These structures, originally designed for equipment storage, were reconfigured with dormitory-style sleeping areas, communal dining facilities, and meeting rooms where Brotherhood members would spend their non-working hours under constant supervision. More significantly, Mueller had begun excavation of underground chambers beneath the mill complex during this period. The work was presented to Brotherhood members as preparation for expanded storage facilities that would improve mill operations and increase profits for everyone. In reality, these chambers were being constructed as ceremonial spaces for ritual activities that would soon include systematic murder. The excavation work was conducted entirely by Brotherhood members during evening hours and weekends. Mueller had convinced them that this labor was sacred service that would earn spiritual rewards, while also ensuring that no outside workers would discover the true purpose of the underground construction. Federal investigators would later discover that the Chamber E excavation followed detailed architectural plans drawn by Mueller himself. The designs, found in his personal papers, showed sophisticated understanding of ventilation, drainage, and concealment techniques that suggested extensive prior planning and possible previous experience with similar construction. The chambers consisted of 3 interconnected rooms carved from bedrock beneath the mill's foundation. The largest space measured 28 feet by 36 feet and was designed with raised platforms that served as altars for ceremonial activities. Smaller chambers were designated for storage of ritual implements and disposal of evidence from activities conducted in the main ceremonial area. Mueller's personal journal, discovered during the 1897 investigation, documented his psychological preparation for the transition from workplace accidents to ritualistic murder. Entries from early 1895 revealed his growing confidence in his ability to control Brotherhood members and his belief that they would comply with increasingly extreme demands, including participation in human sacrifice. The first confirmed murder within the Brotherhood occurred on March 19, 1895. Mary Sullivan, wife of Brotherhood member Patrick Sullivan, had been identified by Mueller as a threat to organizational security due to her continuing contact with relatives outside the community and her expressed desire to leave Millbrook with her children. Mary Sullivan's elimination was carefully planned and documented in Mueller's journal. He spent weeks preparing Brotherhood members psychologically for what he termed the first sacred elevation, using religious rhetoric to frame the murder as divine service rather than criminal violence. The murder took place in the newly completed ceremonial chamber beneath the mill. All adult Brotherhood members were required to attend and participate in what Mueller described as a purification ritual necessary for Mary Sullivan's spiritual advancement. Patrick Sullivan was compelled to assist in his wife's killing as proof of his absolute loyalty to the Brotherhood's sacred mission. According to testimony provided by surviving members during the federal investigation, Mary Sullivan was beaten to death with ceremonial clubs. While Brotherhood members chanted prayers written by Mueller, her death was prolonged and deliberately painful, as Mueller claimed that suffering was necessary for spiritual purification and elevation to a higher plane of existence. Following the murder, Mary Sullivan's body was mutilated according to specific procedures outlined in Mueller's ceremonial instructions. Her heart was removed and preserved in a specially constructed reliquary that Mueller claimed contained sacred power. Other organs were distributed among Brotherhood members as communion elements that bound them together in their shared crime. The disposal of Mary Sullivan's remains revealed Mueller's systematic approach to concealing evidence. Her body was dismembered and buried in multiple locations within the underground chamber complex. The ceremonial mutilation served both religious and practical purposes. making identification more difficult while reinforcing the sacred nature of the killing among cult members. Mary Sullivan's disappearance was explained to outside authorities as voluntary departure from the community. Mueller informed mill management and local officials that she had decided to return to her family in Pittsburgh, taking her children with her. No investigation was conducted, as women frequently left industrial communities without formal notification. The success of Mary Sullivan's murder encouraged Mueller to accelerate his criminal activities. Within weeks, he had established a systematic process for selecting additional victims and had begun expanding the insurance fraud scheme that would ultimately fund his criminal organization while providing financial motive for continued murders. Mueller negotiated increased life insurance coverage for all Brotherhood members during the spring of 1895. Policies were expanded from the standard $200 workplace coverage to $800 per individual. With additional coverage for spouses and children, he established relationships with multiple insurance companies across Pennsylvania and neighboring states to distribute risk and prevent detection of unusual claim patterns. The insurance expansion was presented to Brotherhood members as evidence of Mueller's concern for their family's welfare. He convinced them that the increased coverage demonstrated his commitment to their security and prosperity, while concealing his actual intention to profit from their systematic murder. By summer 1895, Mueller had perfected the process of staging murders as workplace accidents. Brotherhood members selected for elimination were killed during ritualistic ceremonies in the underground chambers, then their bodies were positioned in mill equipment to simulate accidental death. The participation of multiple witnesses in both the murders and the staging ensured absolute secrecy through shared complicity. The psychological conditioning of Brotherhood members had progressed to the point where they competed for opportunities to participate in murders. Mueller had successfully convinced them that involvement in killings was evidence of spiritual advancement and divine favor. Parents expressed willingness to sacrifice their own children if selected, viewing such selection as ultimate honor rather than tragedy. Dr. Samuel L. Brennan, a physician who had recently arrived in Millbrook, became Mueller's crucial partner in the insurance fraud scheme. Brennan provided medical certifications for staged accident deaths, lending credibility to insurance claims while concealing the true nature of the murders. His cooperation was secured through a combination of financial incentives and psychological manipulation similar to techniques used on Brotherhood members. By the end of 1895, 7 Brotherhood members had been murdered in the underground chambers, with their deaths successfully disguised as workplace accidents. Insurance claims totaling $4,200 had been collected and deposited in accounts controlled exclusively by Mueller. The systematic nature of the killings had not yet been detected by local authorities, who continued to view the Millbrook Ironworks as a model of industrial safety and worker welfare. The Brotherhood had evolved from a workplace organization into a criminal cult capable of systematic murder while maintaining complete secrecy. Mueller's psychological control over members was absolute, and his methods for concealing evidence were sophisticated enough to prevent detection by contemporary investigative techniques. The year 1897 marked the beginning of what Mueller's journal would later refer to as the Great Harvest, a systematic campaign of murder that would claim 20 additional lives in less than 11 months. By this time, Mueller's psychological control over the Brotherhood was absolute, and his delusions of divine authority had escalated to the point where he believed himself capable of determining who deserved to live or die. The acceleration began with Mueller's announcement on January 15, 1897, during a mandatory gathering of all Brotherhood members in the main ceremonial chamber. Standing before the assembled cult, Mueller declared that he had received divine revelation requiring the immediate elevation of those whose spiritual development had reached its earthly completion. Eller's announcement was documented in detailed notes taken by his lieutenant Franz Kerner, who served as the Brotherhood's record keeper. According to these notes, Mueller claimed that continued spiritual progress required the removal of individuals whose imperfect faith was contaminating the sacred community. He identified 19 specific people, including 7 children, who would undergo sacred transition during the coming months. The selection criteria revealed Mueller's calculated approach to mass murder. Those chosen for elimination included members who had expressed any doubt about his teachings, individuals with continuing connections to the outside world, and families whose insurance policies offered maximum financial return. Children were specifically targeted because their deaths generated the highest insurance payouts while eliminating potential future witnesses. Elizabeth Kerner, who attended this gathering, would later testify that the announcement created unprecedented terror within the Brotherhood. Members who had previously accepted individual deaths as religious necessity suddenly faced the reality that they or their family members might be selected for elimination. Several parents reportedly begged Mueller to spare their children, offering to take their place in the sacred transition. Mueller's response to these pleas demonstrated his complete psychological domination over the cult. Rather than showing mercy, he used the parents' desperation to reinforce his divine authority, claiming that their willingness to sacrifice themselves proved their spiritual advancement, while their attachment to their children revealed continued worldly corruption requiring correction. The first victims of the mass elimination campaign were the Chen family. Robert Chen, his wife Lynn, and their 18-month-old daughter May. Robert Chen had been identified as a security risk due to his immigrant status and potential connections to Chinese community organizations in Pittsburgh that might investigate his disappearance. The Chen family murders occurred over 3 consecutive nights in February 1897, with each death carefully staged to appear unrelated. Robert Chen was killed first during a Brotherhood ritual on February 8th, with his death subsequently reported as a foundry accident caused by molten metal exposure. His wife and infant daughter were murdered 2 days later in the ceremonial chamber, with their bodies disposed of in the underground complex. The murder of 18-month-old Mei Chen represented a new level of depravity in Mueller's criminal activities. According to witness testimony provided during the federal investigation, the infant was killed during a ceremony attended by all adult Brotherhood members who were required to participate in what Mueller termed purification of innocence. The child's death was prolonged and deliberately painful, as Mueller claimed that suffering was necessary for proper spiritual elevation. Lin Chen's murder followed immediately after her daughter's killing. Brotherhood members who had been forced to witness the infant's death were then compelled to participate in the mother's murder, creating an additional layer of psychological trauma and complicity that ensured absolute secrecy. The systematic nature of these killings demonstrated Mueller's sophisticated understanding of how to maintain control through shared guilt and terror. The disposal of the Chen family bodies revealed the evolution of Mueller's methods. Rather than staging additional workplace accidents, he had begun simply concealing victims within the underground chamber complex, which had been expanded to include specialized storage areas for human remains. This approach reduced the risk of investigative scrutiny while allowing for more frequent killings. The psychological impact of the Chen family murders on surviving Brotherhood members was documented in journal entries and letters discovered during the federal investigation. Parents expressed absolute terror that their own families might be selected for elimination, while children as young as 8 years old were reported discussing their willingness to die for the Brotherhood's sacred mission. Mueller's journal entries from this period revealed his increasing psychological instability and grandiose delusions. He described himself as an agent of divine will whose mission required the systematic purification of humanity through selective elimination of the spiritually unworthy. These writings demonstrated clear awareness of the criminal nature of his activities while attempting to justify them through religious rhetoric. The systematic elimination continued throughout the spring of 1897 with accelerating frequency. 3 additional families were murdered during March and April, including the Morrison family, whose elimination would become one of the most documented and disturbing cases in the federal investigation. James Morrison had been a loyal Brotherhood member since 1895, but had begun expressing private concerns about the organization's direction following the Chen family murders. These doubts were reported to Mueller by other members who had been conditioned to view any questioning of his authority as spiritual corruption requiring correction. Rather than eliminating James Morrison directly, Mueller selected Morrison's 12-year-old daughter Hannah for sacred transition as punishment for her father's insufficient faith. The selection of children as proxies for their parents' perceived sins became a standard technique for maintaining psychological control while maximizing the terror experienced by potential dissidents. Hannah Morrison's murder on April 23, 1897 was particularly brutal even by Brotherhood standards. Mueller required her father to participate directly in the killing, claiming that James Morrison's willingness to sacrifice his daughter would demonstrate his renewed faith and secure salvation for his remaining family members. The ceremony was conducted in the main underground chamber before all Brotherhood members. Hannah Morrison was tortured for approximately 2 hours before her death, with Mueller claiming that prolonged suffering was necessary for proper spiritual purification. James Morrison was compelled to inflict some of the injuries himself, creating psychological trauma that would prevent him from ever reporting the crime to authorities. James Morrison's testimony, provided to federal investigators in December 1897, described the complete psychological breakdown that followed his daughter's murder. He stated that Mueller's religious authority had been so thoroughly established that he genuinely believed his participation in the killing was necessary for his family's eternal salvation, despite his horror at the violence he was committing. The psychological techniques Mueller used to secure compliance with child murder represented the ultimate expression of his criminal sophistication. Through careful conditioning over months and years, he had successfully convinced rational adults that killing their own children was not only acceptable but spiritually necessary for their family's welfare. Following Hannah Morrison's death, the pace of murders accelerated dramatically. Mueller had discovered that the elimination of children created maximum psychological impact on surviving members while generating substantial insurance payouts that funded the Brotherhood's expansion and his personal enrichment. 7 additional children were murdered during the summer of 1897, including 2 sets of siblings whose deaths were staged to appear as separate accidents occurring weeks apart. The systematic nature of these killings required extensive coordination and planning, with Mueller maintaining detailed schedules for murders, insurance claims, and evidence disposal. The underground chamber complex was expanded during this period to accommodate increased ritual activity and body storage. Brotherhood members worked in shifts to excavate additional space, creating a network of interconnected rooms that eventually spanned nearly the entire foundation of the mill complex. These chambers were equipped with ventilation systems, drainage channels, and specialized storage facilities for human remains. Mueller's psychological control over remaining Brotherhood members reached levels that federal investigators would later describe as unprecedented in American criminal history. Surviving members competed for opportunities to participate in murders, viewing such involvement as evidence of spiritual advancement and divine favor. Parents expressed willingness to sacrifice additional children if selected, considering such selection as ultimate honor rather than tragedy. The insurance fraud scheme reached its peak during the summer of 1897, with Mueller collecting payments from 23 different insurance companies across 6 states. The total fraud amount exceeded $35,000 by September, representing enormous wealth for the period while providing financial incentive for continued murders. The systematic nature of the insurance fraud required sophisticated record-keeping and coordination. Mueller maintained detailed files on every policy, claim, and payment, organized to prevent detection while maximizing financial returns. This documentation would later provide federal investigators with comprehensive evidence of the calculated nature of his criminal enterprise. By October 1897, the Brotherhood's membership had declined from 127 individuals in January to 71 survivors. This reduction of 56 people was explained to remaining members as evidence of successful spiritual advancement through voluntary sacrifice, while the reality was systematic murder conducted for financial gain and psychological gratification. The accelerated pace of killings had begun to attract attention from relatives and former associates of disappeared individuals. Several family members contacted local authorities expressing concern about the welfare of Brotherhood members who had ceased all communication with the outside world. These inquiries, initially dismissed by local officials, would eventually prompt the federal investigation that exposed Mueller's crimes. The federal investigation that would expose Heinrich Mueller's crimes began with a simple telegram received by United States Marshal Thomas Brennan on November 12, 1897. The message, sent by Allegheny County Sheriff William Hayes, stated, "Require immediate federal assistance. Multiple disappearances. Local investigation compromised. Suspect organized criminal activity." The telegram was prompted by mounting pressure from relatives of missing Brotherhood members who had been unable to contact their families for months. Margaret O'Brien, sister of disappeared member Catherine Walsh, had traveled from Boston to Millbrook in October and been turned away from the mill with claims that her sister had moved to California. When O'Brien contacted California authorities and discovered no record of her sister's arrival, she demanded federal investigation. Similar inquiries had been made by relatives of the Chen family, the Morrison children, and 8 other missing individuals. The pattern of disappearances, combined with the mill management's evasive responses to family inquiries, created sufficient concern to warrant federal involvement under interstate commerce jurisdiction. Marshal Brennan arrived in Millbrook on November 15th, accompanied by Deputy Marshal James Crawford and Federal Agent William Stevens. Their initial briefing with Sheriff Hayes revealed the extent to which local authorities had been prevented from conducting proper investigations by Mueller's claims of religious privilege and mill confidentiality. Hayes admitted to the federal team that his deputies had been systematically obstructed in their attempts to investigate reported disappearances. Mueller had claimed that Brotherhood activities were protected religious practices and that any interference would violate constitutional provisions regarding freedom of worship. Additionally, mill management had cited industrial confidentiality concerns to prevent examination of workplace accident records. The federal investigators established headquarters at the Millbrook Hotel and began systematic interviews with community members outside the Brotherhood organization. These conversations revealed a consistent pattern of concern about changes in worker behavior and an unusual frequency of workplace accidents at the mill since Mueller's arrival in 1894. Dr. Margaret Walsh provided crucial testimony during these initial interviews. She reported that she had been prevented from examining multiple alleged accident victims by Mueller's claims that Brotherhood religious beliefs prohibited medical intervention by outsiders, the few B. ODs she had been allowed to examine showed injury patterns inconsistent with the reported causes of death. Walsh's medical expertise enabled her to identify specific discrepancies that local authorities had accepted without question. She testified that several supposed accident victims had shown evidence of restraint marks, defensive wounds, and injury patterns suggesting prolonged violence rather than sudden workplace mishaps. The breakthrough in the investigation came through financial analysis conducted by federal agent Stevens. His examination of insurance records revealed that Mueller had filed claims with 23 different companies for deaths occurring at the mill. The total payments of $47,000 represented an impossible accident rate for a facility of Millbrook's size and safety record. Stevens discovered that Mueller had systematically distributed insurance policies across multiple states to prevent any single company from recognizing the suspicious frequency of claims. The coordination required for this scheme demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning rather than coincidental workplace accidents. More significantly, Stevens traced the insurance payments to personal bank accounts controlled exclusively by Mueller. These accounts, maintained under various names across 3 states, contained funds directly traceable to fraudulent death claims. This evidence provided the legal foundation for obtaining search warrants under federal fraud statutes. The first comprehensive search of Brotherhood facilities occurred on November 22, 1897. Federal agents, accompanied by Sheriff Hayes and additional deputies, conducted systematic examination of mill buildings, worker housing, and meeting areas used by the Brotherhood organization. The search initially revealed extensive evidence of unusual activities, but no clear proof of criminal violence. The Brotherhood living areas showed signs of communal organization, with personal belongings redistributed according to unknown, and criteria and sleeping arrangements that separated family members in ways inconsistent with normal household organization. However, Deputy Marshal Crawford's technical background in industrial operations enabled him to identify significant discrepancies in the mill's structural layout. His examination of the facility's foundation revealed irregularities suggesting concealed spaces beneath the main building that were not shown on any architectural plans or safety inspection reports. Crawford discovered the first hidden entrance to the underground chamber complex while examining the mill's basement for evidence of structural problems that might explain the unusual frequency of workplace accidents. Concealed behind a false wall constructed of matching stonework, the entrance led to extensive underground facilities that had never been disclosed to authorities. The initial exploration of the basement chambers provided federal investigators with clear evidence of systematic criminal activity. The main ceremonial room contained stone altars stained with what appeared to be human blood, along with implements designed for restraint and torture. Storage alcoves held personal effects from missing individuals, organized as trophies of successful eliminations. The most horrifying discovery came in the chamber's storage areas, where investigators found the skeletal remains of 17 individuals, including 8 children. Medical examination revealed that all deaths had resulted from homicide rather than accident or natural causes. The organized disposal of bodies indicated long-term criminal activity rather than isolated incidents of violence. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the federal medical examiner brought in to analyze the remains, determined that the victims had died from systematic torture and mutilation consistent with ritualistic murder. The bone evidence showed patterns of violence that could only have resulted from prolonged, deliberate infliction of pain designed to extend suffering before death. The condition of the remains provided clear evidence of the systematic nature of Mueller's crimes. The bodies had been dismembered according to specific procedures, with certain organs removed and preserved in containers found elsewhere in the chamber complex. This organized mutilation suggested extensive planning and possible previous experience with similar activities. Federal investigators also discovered Mueller's personal journal concealed within a specially constructed safe, hidden in the deepest section of the underground complex. The journal contained detailed records of 27 murders committed between April 1894 and October 1897, along with comprehensive documentation of insurance fraud, psychological manipulation techniques, and ceremonial procedures used during ritual killings. The journal entries provided unprecedented insight into the criminal mind of a systematic murderer. Mueller had recorded not only his crimes, but also his methods, motivations, and psychological techniques for maintaining control over cult members. The detail enabled investigators to understand the full scope of his criminal organization and the sophisticated nature of his methods. Heinrich Mueller was arrested on November 24, 1897, at the mill during normal working hours. Federal agents had carefully planned the arrest to prevent potential violence from Brotherhood members who remained under his psychological control. He was charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy under federal jurisdiction. Mueller's initial response to arrest demonstrated his continued belief in his own invincibility and divine authority. He calmly informed federal agents that they were interfering with sacred religious activities protected under constitutional law, and that their investigation would ultimately validate his spiritual mission rather than condemn it. The interrogation of surviving Brotherhood members began immediately following Mueller's arrest. These interviews revealed the extent of psychological control he had exercised over his followers and the sophisticated techniques used to secure compliance with systematic murder. Many Brotherhood members initially refused to acknowledge that crimes had occurred, insisting that deaths had been voluntary sacrifices for spiritual advancement. The depth of their psychological conditioning was such that even when confronted with physical evidence of torture and murder, they maintained faith in Mueller's divine authority and the religious nature of his activities. Elizabeth Kerner became the crucial witness whose testimony broke the conspiracy of silence surrounding Mueller's crimes. Her detailed account, provided over multiple interview sessions, documented the systematic elimination of members and the specific techniques used to secure compliance from survivors. Her willingness to testify against Mueller provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of the Brotherhood's internal structure and criminal operations. Kerner's testimony revealed how Mueller had successfully convinced rational adults to participate in the murder of their own children through systematic psychological manipulation spanning months and years. Her account of the gradual escalation from legitimate workplace meetings to ritualistic human sacrifice provided crucial evidence of Mueller's criminal sophistication and premeditation. The recovery of additional human remains continued throughout December 1897 as investigators expanded their search of mill property, guided by information from cooperating witnesses. Unmarked burial sites were discovered in multiple locations on mill grounds, containing the remains of 10 additional individuals who had been reported missing by relatives outside the Brotherhood community. Each new discovery of human remains provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of Mueller's criminal enterprise. The locations of burial sites demonstrated careful planning and organization rather than desperate concealment of impulsive crimes. The total number of confirmed victims reached 27 individuals, including 14 children. Federal investigators also uncovered the full scope of the insurance fraud scheme through examination of Mueller's detailed financial records. Companies across 6 states had paid fraudulent claims totaling $47,000 for deaths that were actually murders committed for profit. The systematic filing of claims across multiple providers had prevented detection until federal analysis identified the criminal pattern. The federal prosecution of Heinrich Mueller began on February 3, 1898, in the United States District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. The case, formally designated United States v. Heinrich Mueller, represented the most comprehensive prosecution of systematic murder and organized fraud in American legal history. Assistant United States Attorney Robert Morrison led the prosecution team, describing the case as a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The trial attracted national attention from legal experts, journalists, and religious scholars, attempting to understand how a single individual could orchestrate the systematic murder of 27 people while maintaining the facade of legitimate religious and industrial activity. The courtroom was packed daily with observers seeking to comprehend the psychological techniques that had enabled such extensive criminal control. The prosecution's opening statement outlined the systematic nature of Mueller's crimes, emphasizing the calculated planning and financial motivation behind what he had presented as religious activity. Orson told the jury that evidence would demonstrate a criminal organization masquerading as spiritual enlightenment, designed to exploit and ultimately murder innocent families for personal enrichment. The first phase of prosecution evidence focused on the physical remains and medical testimony, establishing the homicidal nature of all deaths previously attributed to workplace accidents or natural causes. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the federal medical examiner, provided detailed testimony about the systematic torture and mutilation revealed through examination of victims' skeletal remains. Dr. Hayes testified that the bone evidence showed patterns of violence that could only have resulted from prolonged, deliberate infliction of pain designed to extend suffering before death. Multiple victims showed evidence of restraint during torture, with stress fractures consistent with struggling against bonds while experiencing extreme physical trauma. The medical testimony included disturbing details about the murders of children whose remains showed evidence of particular brutality. Dr. Hayes testified that several child victims had been systematically tortured over extended periods, with their deaths occurring only after hours of deliberate infliction of pain. The systematic nature of this violence demonstrated clear premeditation and criminal intent. The prosecution then presented Muller's personal journal as primary evidence of his criminal planning and psychological state during the commission of his crimes. The journal contained detailed records of 27 murders, complete with victim selection criteria, ceremonial procedures, and post-murder disposal methods. Federal Agent Stevens read selected journal entries to the jury, providing insight into Muller's psychological evolution from ambitious mill foreman to systematic murderer. Early entries showed calculated assessment into victims' insurance value and potential threat to organizational security. Later passages revealed increasing grandiosity and claims of divine authority that justified systematic human sacrifice. One particularly damning journal entry dated September 15, 1896, stated, "The sacred work progresses according to divine plan. 7 souls have been elevated through purification, generating $4,200 in blessed funds for the Brotherhood's expansion. The children selected for next month's ceremony will provide both spiritual advancement and financial resources necessary for our holy mission." The insurance fraud evidence demonstrated the financial motivation underlying Muller's religious rhetoric. Stevens presented documentation of policies maintained with 23 different companies across 6 states. These were organized to prevent detection while maximizing fraudulent payouts. The systematic nature of this scheme provided clear evidence of criminal intent and sophisticated planning. The prosecution's financial analysis revealed that Muller had personally enriched himself by approximately $31,000 through the systematic murder of Brotherhood members. These funds had been used to support his increasingly lavish lifestyle while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion and community service. Elizabeth Corner provided the prosecution's most compelling witness testimony. She described the systematic psychological manipulation used to secure compliance with murder from rational adults. Her account of the gradual escalation from legitimate workplace meetings to ritualistic human sacrifice demonstrated Muller's sophisticated understanding of psychological control techniques. Kerner testified about specific methods Muller used to convince parents to participate in the murder of their own children. She described the systematic isolation from outside influences, the gradual replacement of family loyalty with cult allegiance, and the use of religious rhetoric to justify increasingly extreme criminal behavior. Her testimony included detailed descriptions of the ceremonial murders she had been forced to witness. She provided the jury with graphic evidence of the systematic torture and mutilation conducted in the underground chambers. Kerner's account was particularly compelling because she had been a willing participant in the early stages of the Brotherhood before recognizing the criminal nature of Muller's activities. James Morrison provided additional testimony about his forced participation in his daughter Hannah's murder. He described the complete psychological breakdown that followed his compliance with Muller's demands. His account demonstrated the extent of psychological control Muller had achieved over cult members and the techniques used to maintain absolute obedience through terror and manipulation. Morrison testified that Muller had convinced him that participating in his daughter's death was necessary for his family's eternal salvation, despite his horror at the violence he was committing. His testimony provided crucial evidence of the systematic psychological abuse used to secure compliance with systematic murder. Dr. Margaret Walsh testified about the medical evidence she had observed during her limited examinations of alleged accident victims. She provided professional corroboration of the systematic deception practiced by Muller and his accomplices. Her testimony established that multiple deaths attributed to workplace accidents had actually resulted from deliberate violence. The prosecution also presented testimony from mill workers outside the Brotherhood who had observed the suspicious behavior and obvious distress of cult members. These witnesses described seeing Brotherhood families in states of fear and psychological trauma, contradicting Muller's claims of voluntary religious participation. No evidence of additional Brotherhood cells was ever discovered during subsequent federal investigations. Mueller's execution marked the end of one of the most sophisticated and extensive criminal organizations in American history. His death provided legal closure for the families of his victims and demonstrated federal commitment to prosecuting organized criminal activity, regardless of the religious or industrial facades used to conceal systematic violence. The Millbrook Ironworks facility was permanently closed following the conclusion of legal proceedings. The basement chambers were filled with concrete after removal of all evidence and human remains. The mill buildings were demolished in late 1898, with the property eventually sold for development as a railroad maintenance facility. The Brotherhood Mill case established precedents that would influence American law enforcement, industrial safety regulation, and psychological research for decades. The systematic nature of Mueller's crimes and the sophisticated methods he employed to maintain criminal control over his followers provided crucial insights into organized criminal activity that transcended traditional understanding of murder and fraud. The case files were immediately classified under federal seal following Mueller's execution, remaining restricted until their transfer to the National Archives in 1967. The 70-year classification period was implemented to protect the privacy of surviving victims and prevent potential glorification of Mueller's criminal methods by future criminals seeking to replicate his techniques. The insurance industry implemented comprehensive reforms following the Brotherhood case, establishing new verification procedures designed to prevent similar systematic fraud schemes. Companies created requirements for independent medical certification of deaths, cross-referencing of claims between providers, and mandatory investigation of unusual claim patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. These industry changes included the establishment of the National Insurance Fraud Prevention Bureau in 1899, which maintained centralized records of all death claims filed across participating companies. This system enabled detection of suspicious patterns that individual companies might miss when dealing with distributed fraud schemes like Mueller's operation. The psychological rehabilitation of Brotherhood survivors represented one of the most challenging aspects of the case's aftermath. 43 individuals, including 16 children, required extensive treatment for what federal medical experts termed systematic psychological trauma, resulting from prolonged exposure to Mueller's manipulation and coerced participation in criminal activities. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a pioneering psychiatrist brought in to treat Brotherhood survivors, documented the long-term effects of systematic psychological manipulation in what became the first comprehensive study of cult-related trauma. Her research, published in the American Journal of Mental Science in 1902, provided crucial insights into the recovery process for victims of organized psychological abuse. Many adult survivors struggled with overwhelming guilt related to their participation in murders, even though federal authorities had determined they were victims rather than willing participants. Several individuals required permanent institutional care, while others relocated to distant communities to escape association with the crimes and begin new lives away from the traumatic memories. The children who survived demonstrated particular difficulty in forming normal relationships and trusting authority figures. Federal authorities established a special fund to provide ongoing educational and psychological support for these young survivors, recognizing that their recovery would require decades of specialized care. The economic impact on the Millbrook community was severe and long-lasting. The closure of the ironworks eliminated 312 jobs and effectively ended the town's primary economic activity. Many families were forced to relocate in search of employment, and the community's population declined by nearly 40% between 1898 and 1905. Federal authorities studied the Brotherhood case extensively to understand the methods used by Mueller to establish and maintain psychological control over his followers. This analysis contributed to the development of investigative techniques for addressing organized criminal activity involving psychological manipulation and systematic violence, techniques that would prove valuable in future cases involving similar criminal organizations. The case influenced federal law enforcement approaches to religious organizations suspected of criminal activity. New guidelines were established for investigating groups that claimed religious protection while engaging in activities that appeared to violate criminal law, balancing constitutional protections with public safety concerns. Academic researchers in the emerging fields of criminal psychology and sociology analyzed Mueller's methods extensively, contributing to early understanding of how charismatic individuals could manipulate group psychology to secure compliance with extreme criminal behavior. These studies provided foundations for later research into cult dynamics and psychological manipulation techniques. The mill property remained vacant for nearly a decade following the demolition of the original buildings. The site's negative reputation made redevelopment difficult despite its advantageous location along the river. The Millbrook Memorial Park was eventually established on the former mill site in 1908, funded through a combination of federal appropriations and private donations from across the region. The memorial includes a monument listing the names of Muller's 27 victims and acknowledging their deaths as results of criminal activity rather than industrial accidents. The underground chambers remain sealed beneath the memorial grounds, filled with concrete and marked by discrete plaques that identify the location without providing details that might attract morbid curiosity. The memorial serves as both tribute to the victims and reminder of the importance of vigilance against those who would abuse positions of authority for criminal purposes. The Brotherhood Mill investigation techniques were adopted by federal agencies for addressing similar cases involving organized criminal activity and systematic fraud. The comprehensive approach developed by Marshall Brennan's team, combining financial analysis, psychological evaluation, and physical evidence examination, became standard procedure for complex criminal investigations. Case file Marshall PA 1997112 was officially closed on December 31, 1900. Following the completion of all legal proceedings, victim compensation efforts, and survivor rehabilitation programs. The investigation had required 3 years and involved federal agents, local authorities, medical examiners, and legal personnel from multiple jurisdictions. The documentation preserved from the Brotherhood Mill investigation continues to serve as a resource for law enforcement agencies, legal scholars, and psychological researchers studying organized criminal activity and systematic manipulation. The case demonstrates the potential for criminal exploitation of religious authority and community isolation, highlighting the ongoing importance of federal oversight in protecting citizens from systematic criminal organizations. The victims of Heinrich Muller's crimes are remembered in the memorial park that now occupies the site of their deaths. Their deaths serve as permanent reminder of the necessity of maintaining vigilance against those who would abuse positions of trust and authority for personal gain, and the importance of federal law enforcement in protecting citizens from systematic criminal exploitation that transcends local jurisdictional boundaries. The Brotherhood Mill investigation remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases of systematic murder and organized fraud in 19th century American law enforcement history. The case established important legal precedents and investigative techniques that continue to influence federal criminal justice procedures. If you made it this far, you're part of the investigation now. Like the video, subscribe for more recovered case files, and drop a comment if you've heard whispers of stories like this where you live. We're still looking.